Welcome to Moon's Fairy Tales. Today, we journey deep into the heart of the lonely mountain with the shadows beneath the gold. What if Smaug's greed and paranoia consumed him entirely? What if the great dragon's desire for treasure trapped him in a web of fear and madness as the whispers of Erebor's ancient halls slowly unravel his mind? Sit back, relax, and let the mysteries of Erebor draw you in. Chapter 1: The Weight of Silence. Deep within the halls of Erebor, beneath its towering pillars and endless labyrinth of tunnels, Smaug stirred upon his hoard. The golden sea beneath him shifted, a metallic whisper that echoed through the vast emptiness of the lonely mountain. For a moment, his great eyes flickered open, glowing like embers in the darkness. His breath was slow, deliberate, yet in its rhythm was an unsettling restlessness. Silence. An all-encompassing, oppressive silence. It clung to the stones of Erebor like a curse, seeping into the very bones of the mountain. The halls that had once echoed with the hammering of dwarf forges, the laughter of miners, and the booming voices of kings were now hushed, filled only with the faint crackle of Smaug's breath. To him, this silence had once been comforting, a sign of dominion, a sign that all had fled before his might. Now, it weighed on him like the cold, suffocating weight of his own treasure. Gold. Mountains of it. Smaug shifted again, his talons scraping across glittering coins, crowns, and jewels. They cascaded down the slopes of his hoard in soft metallic chimes, but even these sounds felt muted in the vast expanse. His treasure surrounded him like a vast, radiant sea, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold gleam of wealth that, despite its vastness, brought no comfort. There was something in the stillness that gnawed at him. Something about the quiet that made even the great dragon uneasy. His mind wandered, as it often did in these empty hours, to the day he had first claimed this mountain. The desire had been all-consuming then, an unquenchable thirst for wealth and power. He had flown from the far north with fire in his heart and a hunger that could not be sated. Erebor had called to him like a beacon, its treasures whispered of in the lands beyond. The mountain's gold had been the obsession of kings and dwarves alike, but it was Smaug who had come to claim it as his own. He remembered the first breath of flame, the roar of his wrath as he descended upon Erebor. The dwarves had scattered before him like leaves in the wind. The fear in their eyes had been delicious. Their screams had echoed through the halls like a song to his ears. And when the last of them had fled or perished, Smaug had settled into the mountain, the conqueror of all he surveyed. But now, the years stretched long. The silence that had once signified his victory now felt heavy. What had been a prize, a symbol of his might, had turned into a prison. Smaug felt it pressing against his scales, suffocating him. He had everything, yet, it seemed, nothing. Not the gold nor the power had filled the hollow space that had grown in his heart. Instead, the silence of Erebor only deepened the void, amplifying it. The once radiant gold beneath him felt dead, its light cold and lifeless. His breath shuddered as a memory crept into his mind, unbidden. There had been a time when this hoard, this mountain of treasure, had meant more. A time when the very thought of possessing it had sent a thrill through his body. But now, something gnawed at him, a doubt, a quiet fear that he had never acknowledged. What if this treasure, this vast empire of gold, was not enough? What if the emptiness he now felt was something deeper, something he could never fill? Foolishness. The thought came unbidden, and Smaug growled deep in his throat, the sound reverberating through the empty chambers of Erebor. It was foolishness to think that he, Smaug the Golden, could ever feel incomplete. He was a conqueror, a king in his own right, a terror known across the lands of Middle-earth. There was nothing he lacked. And yet, in the stillness of the mountain, with nothing but his thoughts for company, doubts began to stir like shadows in the corners of his mind. Smaug could feel the weight of the treasure pressing against him, as though each coin, each gem, was a reminder of his isolation. Erebor was his, and yet he was alone. No enemies dared to challenge him. No kingdom stood in defiance. His name inspired fear, but what was fear worth when there was no one left to fear him? Gold, cold and gleaming, was his only companion now. Smaug shifted again, his massive form sliding through the piles of treasure. The clink of coins was the only sound in the vast halls. He gazed around the cavern, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. There was no movement, no life. Nothing but the stillness and the gold. A flicker of a memory crossed his mind, the dwarves who had once called this place home. Their ambition had been their downfall, their greed their ruin. They had built Erebor into a fortress of wealth, but they had never seen him coming. They had never expected the fire that would consume them. Smaug felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Was it pity? No. He could not pity the dwarves. They had been weak, consumed by their desire for gold. But in their weakness, Smaug saw something of himself. They had been driven by the same hunger that had driven him, only he had been stronger, more ruthless. He had taken what they had only dreamed of possessing. But now, as the years stretched on, he wondered if their fate was not so different from his own. They had built their lives around gold, and in the end, it had destroyed them. Now, Smaug was left to wonder if the same fate awaited him. Was he, too, a prisoner of his own greed? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He let out a low growl, his breath hot against the cold stone of the mountain. No, he would not be like them. He was Smaug, the mightiest of dragons. He was no prisoner, he was the master of this mountain, the king of all he surveyed. And yet, the silence persisted. The weight of the treasure bore down on him, pressing against his scales, suffocating him. Smaug's breaths grew heavier, his mind clouded with thoughts he could not shake. The mountain felt empty, lifeless. Smaug had once taken comfort in the stillness, but now it only served to remind him of what he lacked. He had everything, yet nothing. The silence was a constant reminder of his solitude, his isolation. For a moment, Smaug wished for the sound of footsteps, for the clash of steel, for the roar of battle. Anything to break the suffocating silence that surrounded him. But there was nothing. Only the gold. Chapter 2: Embers of a Forgotten Past. The fires of Smaug's memories burned just as fiercely as the flames that had once poured from his jaws. Even as he lay upon his hoard in the suffocating silence of Erebor, his thoughts drifted backward through centuries of conquest and destruction. The gold beneath him shifted with every breath, a restless reminder of the victories he had claimed, but now, even surrounded by his vast treasure, he found no peace. There was something in his past, something unfulfilled, lingering like a ghost in the corners of his mind. Smaug closed his eyes and let his thoughts sink deeper into the recesses of his memory. He could feel the familiar warmth of his breath against the cold stone, but it was not the present that concerned him. It was the past, the moment when he had first tasted true power. His first act of destruction had been far to the north, beyond the lonely mountain. Smaug had been but a young dragon then, untested, filled with hunger. A small town had stood in his path, a place whose name he no longer remembered. It had been insignificant, nothing more than a collection of wooden huts and unprepared soldiers. But to Smaug, it had been the first taste of dominion. He recalled the moment he descended from the sky, his wings blotting out the sun. The terror on their faces had been delicious, the way they had scattered like insects beneath his shadow. Smaug could still remember the way his chest had swelled with pride, the way his flames had engulfed their homes, reducing them to ashes. The fire had roared around him, consuming everything, and in that moment he had felt invincible. Yet as he lay in the dark silence of Erebor, something about that memory chafed at him. The victory had been too easy. The fear had been sweet, but fleeting. What good was terror if it burned out as quickly as the flames? What good was conquest if those he conquered were too weak to resist? Smaug's claws scraped against the gold beneath him as his mind wandered to his next conquests. Town after town, kingdom after kingdom had fallen before him. Each time, the fires had burned brighter, the screams had grown louder, and his hunger for destruction had grown deeper. He had become the scourge of the north, a name whispered in fear across the lands. No army had stood against him. No blade had pierced his scales. Smaug the Magnificent, they had called him. But now, in the cold quiet of the mountain, that name felt hollow. He had thought that with each conquest, with each hoard of gold he claimed, the emptiness inside him would be filled. Yet it was not. Even as he slaughtered kings and claimed their treasures, even as he bathed in the flames of his own destruction, there had always been something missing. The memory of one of those ruined towns flickered before him now. The fires had burned for days, and the screams had been unending. And yet, as he watched it all crumble beneath his power, he had felt nothing. No triumph, no glory, only the nagging sense that something more should have come from his destruction. His victories had been hollow. His enemies, weak. Even Erebor, with all its riches, had not sated the deep hunger in his soul. The dwarves had fallen before him like all the others. Their greed had rivaled his own, but in the end, they had proven no different than the towns of men. They had fled before him, abandoning their gold, their homes, and their pride. They had left him alone with his hoard, and the silence of the mountain had become his only companion. What had he truly gained? For a long time, Smaug had believed that the treasure itself would be enough. The sheer weight of it, the glimmering gold and precious jewels, should have been a reward in itself. It was wealth beyond imagination, power in its most tangible form. But now, after so many years, the treasure felt like a chain binding him to this mountain, a reminder of everything he had taken and everything he had lost. Smaug's thoughts turned darker, more bitter. His eyes opened, burning like coals in the darkness, as his memories shifted once more. He could still hear the faint echoes of his past victories, the crackle of his flames as they consumed the lands. But those sounds now seemed distant, muted. What was once thrilling now felt empty. He remembered a time when the whispers of Sauron had reached him, carried on the winds of Mordor. The Dark Lord had spoken of dominion, of forging alliances that could bend Middle-earth to his will. But Smaug had no need of alliances. He was a force unto himself, a dragon whose hunger for power surpassed even the ambitions of Dark Lords. What need had he of others? Yet even as he had scorched the earth and claimed his hoards, Smaug had begun to sense something deeper, a shadow lurking behind his every conquest, a cold emptiness that not even the greatest treasures could fill. He had tried to bury it, tried to cover it with gold and jewels, but now, lying alone in the dark, there was no escaping it. The silence of Erebor pressed down on him like a weight, a constant reminder of his solitude. His victories, his conquests, had left him isolated, trapped within the very mountain he had claimed for himself. His gold was vast, his power unmatched, but what had it all amounted to? The endless hunger that had driven him for so long was still there, gnawing at him like a wound that would never heal. In his heart, Smaug knew the truth. He had thought that by conquering, by destroying, he could find meaning. But now, surrounded by the cold emptiness of his treasure, he realized that his victories had brought him nothing but loneliness. The weight of his past pressed down upon him, heavier than the gold beneath his claws. Smaug's breaths grew shallow, his mind clouded by the memories of fire and blood, of cities laid to waste and kingdoms brought to ruin. And yet, in all of it, there was no satisfaction. Only the endless, gnawing emptiness that had haunted him since the beginning. He let out a low growl, a deep rumble that echoed through the empty halls of Erebor. His wings twitched, shifting the treasure beneath him, but it brought no comfort. The past was gone, the flames had died, and all that was left was the cold, suffocating silence of the mountain. Smaug's thoughts drifted back to that first town, that first taste of power. He had been so hungry then, so desperate to prove himself, to carve his name into the very stones of Middle-earth. But now, looking back, he could see the futility of it all. No amount of gold, no number of victories, could ever fill the void within him. The dragon's eyes closed once more, but there was no peace to be found in the darkness. Only the distant, fading memories of a time when the fires still burned bright. When the screams of his enemies had filled the air, and he had believed, if only for a moment, that he could be satisfied. But satisfaction had never come. And now, it seemed it never would. Chapter 3: The Echoes of Erebor. The stillness of Erebor was no longer comforting. What once signified Smaug's complete dominion over the lonely mountain now felt heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his mind. The silence was unnatural, not the peaceful quiet of a world at rest, but the tense, suffocating kind filled with the absence of life. Smaug lay upon his hoard, his great wings folded, his head resting on a pile of gold as the faintest sound reached his ears. It was subtle, barely there, a whisper, or was it a sigh? The mountain's caverns had strange ways of carrying sounds, of making nothingness echo in unexpected ways. His eyes opened, glowing faintly in the dim light of the treasure chamber. Whispers. They had been creeping into his thoughts for some time now, lurking at the edges of his consciousness. At first, they had been nothing more than a product of his solitude, the mountain's eerie acoustics playing tricks on him. But now, they seemed closer, more persistent. Smaug shifted, his massive body disturbing the sea of gold beneath him. The clinking of coins filled the chamber, a comforting sound, grounding him in reality. Yet, even as the noise settled, the echoes persisted, faint and distant, but undeniably present. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the darkened corners of the great hall, though he knew no one was there. No one dared to enter his domain. But what if? What if someone had come? What if, in the endless expanse of Erebor's tunnels, there lurked a shadow, an intruder? Smaug's paranoia began to fester. It had been so long since anyone had dared challenge him, so long since he had last heard the voices of dwarves, men, or elves. And yet, the memories of that time were still vivid. He remembered the day he had taken the mountain for himself, driving the dwarves from their halls with fire and wrath. The stench of burning flesh and wood had filled the air, the heat of his flames scorching everything in his path. The dwarves had fled in terror, and Smaug had laughed, his victory complete. But had they all fled? The thought gnawed at him. He had destroyed most of them, he was certain. He had scorched the very stones of Erebor, leaving nothing but ashes in his wake. But what if some had survived? What if they had returned, seeking vengeance? Smaug let out a low growl, the sound reverberating through the chamber, causing the gold beneath him to tremble. He could feel the paranoia creeping in, slowly, like a poison in his veins. The whispers in the darkness were not just echoes of the past, they were warnings of the present. Survivors. The word lingered in his mind like a curse. Could there still be dwarves hiding in the depths of the mountain? Waiting, watching, biding their time until the moment was right to strike? It seemed impossible, but the thought would not leave him. His mind was no longer his own. It was filled with the echoes of Erebor, memories of destruction, of fire and blood, but also something more insidious. The dwarves had been driven from their home, yes, but they had not been defeated in spirit. Their ambition, their greed, had rivaled even his own. And that ambition, it never died. Smaug's eyes flicked toward the far corners of the chamber, where the darkness seemed to pulse and shift, alive with unseen movement. His claws dug into the gold beneath him, the sharp edges of the coins pressing against his scales. Was something there? Or was it simply his mind, playing tricks on him? The emptiness of the mountain, once so comforting, now felt like a trap. Smaug could feel his paranoia growing with each passing moment, fueled by the silence, by the whispers that refused to fade. He remembered the dwarves, their greed, their lust for gold. They had built this kingdom upon that greed, and it had destroyed them. Now, as Smaug lay upon the very treasure they had coveted, he wondered if he, too, was falling prey to the same curse. He growled again, louder this time, the sound echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. The walls of Erebor seemed to tremble with the force of his voice, but still, the whispers remained, faint but insistent. Was it guilt? No. He felt no guilt for what he had done to the dwarves. They had been weak, and he had taken what was rightfully his. But there was something about their ambition that haunted him still. They had been willing to risk everything for their gold, to build their lives around it, even as it consumed them. In that way, perhaps, they were not so different from him. The thought unsettled him. He was a dragon, a being of power and fire, of destruction. The dwarves had been mortal, their lives fleeting and insignificant. And yet, Smaug could not shake the feeling that they had left something behind, some trace of their greed, their ambition, that still lingered in the very stones of the mountain. His mind began to race, filled with visions of the dwarves returning, creeping through the tunnels of Erebor like ghosts, their eyes burning with the same hunger that had once driven them. He could see them now, their bearded faces twisted with rage and desperation, their hands clutching axes and hammers, ready to reclaim what they had lost. But they would not take it. They could not take it. Erebor was his. Smaug's body tensed, his muscles coiling as if ready to strike, though there was no one to fight. The whispers grew louder in his mind, until they were no longer just echoes, but voices of the dead, of the dwarves who had fallen beneath his fire, crying out for revenge. His breath quickened, the heat rising in his chest. The air around him shimmered with the intensity of his inner flame. For a moment, he considered rising from his hoard, stalking through the halls of the mountain to hunt down the ghosts that haunted him. But he knew there was no one there. No dwarves, no survivors. Only shadows. Only whispers. And yet, Smaug could feel the fear growing within him, a fear he had not known in centuries. The fear that someone, somewhere, was watching. That the mountain was no longer his alone. The silence of Erebor was no longer safe. It was a prison, a tomb filled with the memories of the past and the threats of the future. Smaug's paranoia gnawed at him like a disease, eating away at his confidence, his sense of invincibility. What if the dwarves had returned? What if they had found a way back into the mountain, creeping through the tunnels, waiting for the right moment to strike? Smaug's eyes narrowed, his breath coming in deep, slow hisses. He would not be caught off guard. He would not allow himself to fall prey to the same ambition that had destroyed the dwarves. This mountain was his, and his alone. No one would take it from him. But as the whispers grew louder, as the shadows seemed to pulse and shift in the corners of the great hall, Smaug could not shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he could not see, but could feel, lurking just beyond his reach. He would not be taken by surprise. He would not be defeated. But in the dark, in the silence of Erebor, Smaug's mind began to turn on itself, filling with the echoes of his own paranoia, and the mountain that had once been his refuge now felt like a cage. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of the mountain, the whispers continued, promising that Smaug's greatest enemy was not the dwarves, nor the men of the lake, but his own mind. The paranoia was only beginning. Chapter 4: The Blackened Heart. The darkness within Erebor was no longer just around Smaug, it had settled inside him, festering like a wound that would not heal. His mind, once sharp and powerful, had become a labyrinth of doubt, fear, and paranoia. The whispers that echoed in the vast halls were now a constant presence, gnawing at his sanity, turning his once iron resolve into fragile glass. His heart, once burning with ambition, had become a void, blackened by the weight of his greed. As Smaug lay upon his vast hoard, the gold no longer felt like a blessing. The gleam of treasure that had once filled him with a dragon's pride now seemed dull, like a light that had lost its warmth. He shifted uneasily, his massive form causing waves of coins to cascade down the sides of his treasure pile, their clinking sound sharp and irritating to his ears. The mountain was quiet, but the silence had become unbearable. Every shadow felt like an enemy, every distant sound a threat. Smaug's claws twitched, his senses heightened to the point of madness. He could no longer trust the stillness, his mind conjured enemies from the very air. The once mighty dragon was being undone by the very thing he had sought to claim, his greed. His dreams had become nightmares. When Smaug closed his eyes, he saw fire and blood, but not the glorious flames of his youth. No, these flames were cold, twisted, flicking at the edges of his hoard, threatening to consume it all. In his dreams, he saw the dwarves returning, their eyes burning with a hatred as fierce as his own. They crawled through the darkened tunnels like rats, seeking to reclaim what he had taken. And worst of all, he saw himself, weak, his scales brittle, his flame dying as they took from him the only thing that mattered, his treasure. Smaug awoke from these dreams with a growl, his breath searing hot in the chill of the mountain. His tail lashed, scattering coins and jewels, but the action brought him no relief. The dreams had begun to follow him into the waking world, blending with the whispers, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was phantom. In the deep recesses of his mind, he thought of Sauron. The Dark Lord had once reached out to him, offering whispers of power and dominion over Middle-earth. Smaug had scoffed at the time. What need had he of alliances? He was Smaug the Magnificent, the greatest of all dragons. No dark power could offer him more than what he already had. But now, as the whispers grew louder and the shadows pressed in around him, Smaug wondered if perhaps there had been truth in Sauron's words. The Dark Lord had spoken of control, of bending all living things to his will. Smaug had believed himself to be beyond such temptations, for he had already taken what he wanted from the world. But now, the very thing he had taken was slipping through his claws. Could there be more than gold? Smaug's mind flickered with the thought, though he quickly tried to push it away. His heart, though blackened and hollow, still clung to the one truth he had known all his life: gold was everything. It was the only thing that truly mattered, the only thing that had ever given his existence meaning. But the treasure was no longer enough. Smaug's once proud heart felt like a void, an endless abyss of emptiness. No matter how much he hoarded, no matter how many riches he surrounded himself with, the emptiness grew. His greed, once a source of strength, had become a chain binding him to the mountain. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any crown or throne. He could not leave Erebor. The thought itself filled him with dread. The outside world, with its endless dangers, was no place for a dragon who had grown soft and bloated on his own avarice. But more than that, Smaug could not bear the thought of leaving his treasure unguarded. What if someone, something, came while he was gone? What if they took even a single piece from his hoard? The fear was unbearable. Smaug let out a roar that shook the foundations of Erebor, his frustration spilling over in a wave of sound. The echoes bounced off the stone walls, returning to him in distorted, mocking tones. The mountain itself seemed to laugh at him, as though it knew his weakness, his growing vulnerability. And then there was the gold. Smaug's gaze flicked to it, his sharp eyes narrowing as he surveyed the endless piles of treasure beneath him. He had everything, and yet he had nothing. The more he looked at it, the more the treasure seemed to mock him, reflecting his own emptiness back at him. The gold had no warmth, no life. It was cold, indifferent, a testament to his greed, but not his power. Smaug shifted uneasily again, his massive tail curling around a mound of gems. He could feel the weight of his own body pressing down on the hoard, as though the treasure itself were trying to suffocate him. And perhaps it was. Perhaps this was his punishment, to be buried beneath the very thing he had sought to claim. A sudden thought struck him, sharp as a blade. What if there is more? Smaug had spent centuries believing that gold was the only thing that mattered, the only thing worth possessing. But now, as his mind frayed and his heart blackened, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. Could there be something beyond treasure, something greater, something that could fill the void that now consumed him? But the thought was too terrible to bear. Smaug rejected it, shoving it deep into the recesses of his mind. He could not, would not, believe that there was anything more valuable than his hoard. To admit that would be to admit his own failure, his own weakness. And Smaug was not weak. He was the greatest of all dragons. He had claimed Erebor, had taken the treasure of a kingdom and made it his own. He had conquered dwarves, men, and elves alike. He had laid waste to entire kingdoms with nothing but the fire of his breath. But still, the emptiness remained. His heart, once filled with the heat of ambition, was now a void of darkness. His desire for gold, once all-consuming, now felt like a burden he could no longer bear. And worst of all, the whispers had not ceased. They echoed in his mind, taunting him with his own fear, his own paranoia. Smaug closed his eyes, trying to block out the voices, the endless whispers that told him he had failed. But they would not be silenced. They reminded him of the dwarves, of the men who still lived beyond the mountain, waiting for their chance to strike. They reminded him of his own fragility, his own mortality. For dragons were not immortal. Even Smaug, the greatest of his kind, would one day die. And then what would become of his treasure? The thought terrified him. His hoard, his treasure, would be taken, divided, and scattered by those who had not earned it. His gold, his power, would be lost forever. Smaug's heart pounded in his chest, the void inside him threatening to consume him whole. He could feel the fear rising within him, a fear he had not known in centuries. And with that fear came the realization he was not as strong as he had once believed. His heart, blackened by greed and ambition, was no longer capable of the fire that had once driven him. It was empty, cold, and crumbling beneath the weight of his own paranoia. And as the whispers grew louder, as the shadows pressed in around him, Smaug knew that his greatest enemy was no longer the dwarves nor the men of the lake, but the darkness within his own heart. He was trapped. Not by the gold, nor by the mountain, but by his own fear. And there was no escape. Chapter 5. The Whisper of Shadows. The air in Erebor had grown thicker, as if the very stone was conspiring against Smaug. His senses were on edge, heightened to a fever pitch, his mind constantly darting from one shadow to the next. The once vast, empty halls of the lonely mountain now felt crowded, filled with things unseen, moving, always moving, just beyond his sight. The gold beneath him, once a comfort, now felt unsettling. It shifted too easily, as if something crawled beneath the surface, waiting. The whispers were louder now. They echoed endlessly in the caverns, but their origin was unknowable. They had no beginning, no end, just a constant, nagging presence that slithered through his thoughts like a serpent. Smaug's paranoia had consumed him entirely, and he could no longer trust his own senses. It was as if the very mountain had turned against him, mocking him with voices that he could not silence. He had heard them again the night before, faint whispers, like the sound of footsteps or the hiss of a distant voice. At first, they had seemed like nothing more than the shifting of the mountain stones, but now, Smaug was certain that something was in the mountain with him. His once impenetrable domain, the kingdom of gold he had claimed, was no longer safe. Smaug's eyes flickered open in the darkness, glowing like embers as he scanned the vast chamber around him. The shadows were deeper here, in the heart of his hoard, where the weight of the treasure pressed down like a living thing. His breath came in slow, deliberate waves, but his mind was racing. Somewhere in the depths of Erebor, something moved. He was sure of it. Perhaps it was the dwarves, returned from the dead, their vengeful spirits come to claim what was once theirs. Or perhaps it was something older, something more ancient than even Smaug. His paranoia had grown so thick that he could no longer separate truth from delusion, memory from madness. He had never been one to fear the shadows. But now they seemed to watch him, to crawl along the walls of the cavern like living things, always just out of reach. His claws scraped against the gold beneath him, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness of the mountain. It was as if even the sound of metal on metal could not pierce the veil that had fallen over his mind. Smaug rose from his hoard, the great piles of gold shifting and cascading beneath his weight. Coins and jewels scattered in every direction, clattering against the stone with a sound that echoed endlessly through the halls. But even the sound of his own treasure falling could not comfort him. There was something in the silence, something lurking, waiting for him to let his guard down. The shadows had eyes. He could feel them, watching him, whispering to him, conspiring in the darkness. Smaug's breaths grew heavier, hotter, as he paced restlessly across the chamber, his tail lashing against the piles of gold, scattering more of his precious hoard. The once meticulous order of his treasure was now in disarray, but Smaug no longer cared. His mind was unraveling, piece by piece, and all he could think about were the voices in the dark. "Show yourselves." Smaug's voice thundered through the mountain, shaking the very foundations of Erebor. His roar echoed off the walls, multiplying until it seemed as though 1,000 dragons were roaring in unison. But no one answered. The shadows remained silent, the whispers still just beyond his grasp. In his fury, Smaug lashed out with his claws, sending piles of treasure crashing down from their carefully arranged mounds. Gold and jewels cascaded like waterfalls, glittering in the dim light, but they brought him no satisfaction. His once magnificent hoard now seemed tainted, infested with the same darkness that haunted his mind. The shadows whispered again, faint and mocking, like laughter just beyond his hearing. Smaug's eyes narrowed, his fiery gaze sweeping across the chamber. He could feel it, something was watching him, just out of sight, lurking in the crevices of the mountain. He would find it. He would burn it out, destroy whatever dared to threaten his domain. "I know you're here," Smaug growled, his voice low and menacing. He stalked through the halls of Erebor, his massive form moving with a predatory grace. Every step he took sent tremors through the mountain, the sound of his claws scraping against stone like the grinding of bones. He ventured deeper into the labyrinth of Erebor, the light of his fiery breath casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The deeper he went, the darker it became, until even Smaug's inner fire seemed dim, swallowed by the oppressive gloom of the mountain. The air here was thick, heavy with the weight of centuries, and Smaug could feel the cold stone closing in around him. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just echoes, they were voices, clear and unmistakable, though he could not understand the words. They seemed to speak in a language older than the dwarves, older than men. A language of stone and shadow, of the very bones of the earth. Smaug's paranoia reached its peak. His mind, already frayed and weakened by his endless solitude, began to fracture. He could no longer tell if the whispers were real or if they were born from his own madness. But it didn't matter. He would find them. He would find whatever dared to defy him and destroy it. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, filling the air with their soft, insidious murmurings. Smaug's claws dug into the stone as he moved, his great wings folded tightly against his body as he prowled through the halls. He could feel the shadows moving with him, always just out of sight, always just beyond his reach. He descended further into the depths of Erebor, into places where even the dwarves had seldom gone. The stone here was ancient, untouched by time or war, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they knew he was coming. And then, in the deepest, darkest chamber of the mountain, Smaug stopped. Before him lay a vast pile of gold, untouched for centuries, glittering faintly in the dim light. But there was something wrong. The gold, it moved. For a moment, Smaug thought his eyes had betrayed him, that his mind had finally snapped under the weight of his madness. But no, the gold was moving, shifting, as though something beneath it was stirring. His breath caught in his throat, his eyes narrowing as he watched the slow, deliberate motion of the treasure. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, filling the chamber with their maddening chorus. Smaug's heart pounded in his chest, his claws digging into the stone as he prepared to strike. Whatever was beneath that gold, whatever was hiding in his hoard, he would burn it out. He would show it the full wrath of a dragon. With a deafening roar, Smaug unleashed a torrent of flame, his fiery breath consuming the chamber in a blinding blaze of light and heat. The gold melted beneath his fury, turning to liquid fire, but still the whispers persisted, louder than ever, filling the air with their mocking laughter. Smaug's rage reached its peak. He tore into the hoard with his claws, scattering molten gold and jewels in every direction, but no matter how much he destroyed, the shadows remained. The whispers would not stop. They surrounded him, suffocated him, until he could no longer breathe. His mind, once sharp and calculating, was now a fractured shell, consumed by the paranoia that had haunted him for so long. The treasure he had fought so hard to claim, the hoard that had once been his greatest prize, was now a prison, a suffocating weight that he could no longer bear. And as the last of the gold melted away, as the flames died down and the shadows closed in around him, Smaug realized the terrible truth. The whispers had never been real. The only enemy he had ever faced was the one within his own mind. The shadows had never been alive. But now, they owned him. Chapter 6: The Dragon's Curse. The once mighty halls of Erebor had never felt so empty, so utterly lifeless. The air was still, as if the very mountain had ceased to breathe along with its master. Smaug lay upon what remained of his hoard, but it no longer comforted him. The gold, now melted and scattered from his wrath, no longer gleamed with the allure of wealth and power. Instead, it pressed down on him, a crushing weight of his own making. The treasure he had once coveted above all else had become his prison. His body, vast and fearsome, no longer moved with the ease of a predator. His once proud scales now felt heavy, the flame inside him dimmed. The great fire of his ambition had burned so fiercely for so long, but now it flickered weakly, reduced to embers. The heat that had once consumed cities, turned armies to ash, and driven entire kingdoms to fear had faded. Smaug's breath came slow and labored, the sound of them echoing faintly in the cavernous hall. But there was no one left to hear, no one to cower before his terrible presence. Alone. That was what he had become. Alone with his treasure, alone with his thoughts, alone with his madness. The whispers had gone, leaving behind only a vast, suffocating silence. For so long, Smaug had been haunted by the voices, real or imagined, of enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting to steal his hoard. He had fought them, destroyed his own treasure in the process, trying to unearth the phantoms that had never existed. But now, in the stillness that followed the destruction, he understood the truth. There had never been any enemies. No dwarves seeking revenge, no hidden thieves creeping through the mountain's depths. The only enemy Smaug had ever faced was the one inside his own mind. The treasure. It was the treasure that had done this to him. The gold he had sought for so long, the wealth he had fought for, killed for, it had become his curse. He had thought it would bring him power, control, and dominion over all the lands. But instead, it had shackled him, chained him to this cold, lifeless mountain where even his own thoughts had turned against him. Smaug's eyes flickered open, glowing dimly in the darkness. The mountain was silent now, as though it, too, had finally abandoned him. His great wings lay folded against his sides, their weight pulling him deeper into the gold that surrounded him. He could no longer feel the joy, the satisfaction that the treasure once brought. All he could feel was the overwhelming emptiness, a void that no amount of gold could fill. For the first time in his long life, Smaug understood the horror of his situation. He had spent centuries hoarding wealth, claiming kingdoms, and burning all who stood in his way, but none of it had brought him the peace he sought. His greed had consumed him until there was nothing left of the dragon he once was. His power, his might, had been hollowed out by his own endless desire. He had been wrong. So terribly wrong. Smaug's heart, blackened and cold, felt the weight of realization. His curse had never been the whispers of shadows, nor the threat of dwarves seeking to reclaim Erebor. His curse had been the very thing he coveted, the gold, the treasure. It had enslaved him, trapped him within the very mountain he had taken for his own. And now, it had destroyed him. The dragon's once terrifying growl was now little more than a low rumble, filled with regret and anger. But there was no fire left to burn away his torment, no breath left to unleash his fury. Smaug was spent, his strength fading along with the madness that had consumed him for so long. The mighty Smaug the Terrible had been reduced to nothing more than a prisoner of his own making, shackled by the very thing he had once thought would make him immortal. He gazed out into the darkness of the cavern, his vision blurred by the weight of his thoughts. He had always believed that his greed would protect him, that as long as he possessed the treasure, he would remain powerful, untouchable. But now, he saw the truth. Greed had been his downfall. The treasure had not brought him the glory or the immortality he had sought. Instead, it had poisoned him, turning his mind against itself, twisting his heart into something dark and hollow. Smaug, who had once feared nothing, had become a slave to his own desire. The gold beneath him felt heavier than ever, pressing down on his body like a weight he could not lift. He had spent so long guarding this treasure, hoarding it, believing that it was the key to his power. But now, he could no longer feel its allure. The gold was cold, lifeless, and it offered him no comfort, no escape from the emptiness that gnawed at his soul. The mountain, too, had betrayed him. It had once been a place of triumph, a symbol of his might and dominance. But now it felt like a tomb, a prison from which there was no escape. Smaug could feel the weight of the stone closing in around him, the silence of the mountain pressing down on him like the gold itself. He was trapped, not by enemies or invaders, but by the isolation of his own greed. Smaug let out a final, weak growl, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. His wings shifted slightly, but he could not summon the strength to lift himself from the hoard. His body, once so powerful, was now weighed down by the treasure he had so desperately sought to protect. But what was there left to protect? The gold no longer mattered. The treasure, the power, the dominion over Erebor, it was all meaningless now. He had thought himself a king, but in the end, he was nothing more than a prisoner of his own desires. The silence grew thicker, colder. Smaug's eyes, once burning with the fire of his ambition, began to dim. His breaths grew shallow, each one a struggle against the crushing weight of his treasure. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but the suffocating emptiness of his greed. The dragon's thoughts, once so sharp, so filled with pride, began to fade into the darkness. His mind, like the gold around him, had been consumed by the curse of his own making. And as the last of his strength slipped away, Smaug understood that his fate had been sealed from the moment he first laid eyes on Erebor's treasure. He had desired too much. He had taken too much. And now, he would pay the price. As the shadows closed in around him, as the final whispers of his mind faded into silence, Smaug let out one last, quiet breath. His great body settled into the hoard, the gold beneath him shifting slightly, as if the mountain itself was finally claiming him. The once mighty dragon, Smaug the Magnificent, was no more. His greed, his desire, had consumed him, and in the end, it had been the very thing that destroyed him. In the deep, suffocating silence of Erebor, Smaug was alone, forever trapped beneath the weight of his curse. And there, in the heart of the lonely mountain, the last embers of Smaug's flame flickered out, swallowed by the endless dark. If you enjoyed this dark journey into Smaug's mind, there's so much more to come. Don't miss out on the next chapter as we dive even deeper into the shadows of Erebor and uncover more secrets lurking beneath the gold. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new adventure. Your support keeps the stories alive and the mysteries unfolding. See you in the next tale.